In 1957, one American car brand sold more than 120,000 vehicles in a single year. Just 4 years later, that same brand would disappear from the automobile market entirely. The company was DeSoto. At its peak, DeSoto was one of the most visible names on American roads. Thousands of workers assembled its cars inside the massive factories of Detroit, while dealerships across the United States sold its chrome-covered sedans to a rapidly expanding middle class. Long grills, sweeping tailfins, and powerful V8 engines made DeSoto vehicles unmistakable symbols of the post-war automobile boom. The brand belonged to Chrysler Corporation, one of the three giants that dominated the American auto industry, alongside Ford Motor Company and General Motors. For more than 3 decades, DeSoto had been an important piece of Chrysler's strategy. Positioned between affordability and luxury, the brand was designed to capture America's growing middle class, buyers who wanted something more refined than basic transportation, but who were not ready to pay the price of a full luxury car. In many ways, DeSoto represented the optimism of mid-century America. Its cars promised modern engineering, bold styling, and upward mobility in a country where automobile ownership had become one of the clearest symbols of personal success. But in 1961, something extraordinary happened. Without warning, and DeSoto production stopped. Assembly lines that had once produced thousands of vehicles each month went silent. Dealerships quietly removed the DeSoto name from their showrooms. Within a matter of weeks, one of America's most recognizable automotive brands vanished from the market. There was no dramatic bankruptcy battle, no public scandal that forced the company into collapse. Instead, the brand was erased through a quiet decision made inside Chrysler's executive offices. In less than 4 years, DeSoto had gone from 6-figure annual production to complete extinction. How does a successful automobile brand disappear so quickly? What internal decisions led Chrysler to eliminate one of its own divisions? And how did a company that once symbolized the strength of American manufacturing become one of the most forgotten names in automotive history? To answer those questions, and we have to go back to 1928, a moment when the American automobile industry was expanding faster than any industrial sector the world had ever seen. Because the story of DeSoto did not begin with its collapse. It began with an ambitious strategy designed to dominate the entire automobile market, a strategy that would eventually destroy the very brand it created. If you enjoy deeply researched stories about America's forgotten factories, industrial empires, and the cities they built, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments which lost factory or industrial giant you'd like us to explore next. Chapter 1: Industrial America and the Birth of DeSoto. By the late 1920s, the automobile had become the most powerful engine of economic transformation in the United States. What had once been a luxury novelty for the wealthy had evolved into the backbone of modern American life. Factories stretched across the industrial landscape of the Midwest, producing millions of vehicles each year. Railroads transported steel, rubber, and glass into enormous manufacturing complexes. While newly paved highways carried finished cars into every corner of the country. At the center of this industrial transformation stood Detroit, a city that had rapidly become the global capital of automobile manufacturing. By the end of the 1920s, Detroit was producing the majority of the world's automobiles. Massive factories operated around the clock, employing hundreds of thousands of workers and transforming the region into one of the most productive industrial hubs in modern history. 3 companies dominated this rapidly expanding industry. Ford Motor Company, the pioneer of mass production, had revolutionized manufacturing through the moving assembly line. Its Model T had put millions of Americans behind the wheel for the first time. General Motors, under the leadership of Alfred P. Sloan, had introduced a different strategy, one based not only on engineering, but also on branding. GM structured its companies into a carefully organized hierarchy that moved customers from affordable models to increasingly luxurious vehicles as their income grew. But by the mid-1920s, a third competitor was rising rapidly. That company was Chrysler Corporation, founded in 1925 by automotive engineer and industrial strategist Walter P. Chrysler. Unlike many early automobile entrepreneurs, Walter Chrysler was not primarily an inventor. He was a master of industrial organization. Before entering the automobile business, he had worked extensively in the railroad industry, where efficiency, scale, and operational discipline determined success. When Chrysler entered the automobile industry, he understood something crucial. Building a successful car company required more than designing a good vehicle. It required a carefully planned corporate structure capable of competing across multiple segments of the market. Ford dominated the low-cost mass production segment. General Motors dominated the tiered luxury structure. Chrysler needed a strategy that could compete with both. The company quickly acquired several existing automotive manufacturers, including Dodge Brothers in 1928, expanding its industrial capacity and dealer network. But Chrysler executives recognized a major gap in their lineup. They lacked a strong brand positioned in the growing mid-price automobile market. During the 1920s, America's middle class was expanding rapidly. Rising wages and industrial prosperity allowed millions of families to afford cars that were more advanced and stylish than the cheapest entry-level vehicles, yet still far less expensive than luxury automobiles. This segment of the market was becoming one of the most competitive and profitable areas of the entire industry. Chrysler needed a brand that could compete directly in that space. And so, in 1928, the company introduced a new automobile division. That brand was DeSoto. And named after the Spanish explorer Hernando DeSoto, the brand symbolized ambition, exploration, and forward movement, qualities that Chrysler wanted associated with its newest vehicles. But DeSoto was not launched cautiously. Chrysler introduced it on a national scale from the very beginning. Extensive advertising campaigns promoted the brand across newspapers, magazines, and billboards. A nationwide network of dealerships was established almost immediately, and ensuring that the new vehicles would be available to customers across the United States. Production lines were rapidly expanded to support the launch. When the first DeSoto cars rolled out of factories in 1928, the response from the market was immediate. In its very first year, DeSoto sold more than 80,000 vehicles. At the time, this was an extraordinary achievement. No other automobile brand had ever reached such high sales numbers during its first year of production. The launch instantly positioned DeSoto as one of the most successful new brands in the history of the American automobile industry. Within Chrysler's expanding corporate structure, DeSoto appeared to have found its ideal role. It offered customers a vehicle that felt more refined than the cheapest entry-level cars, but remained far more affordable than luxury models. It represented upward mobility. For thousands of American families entering the middle class during the late 1920s, a DeSoto was not just transportation. It was a symbol of economic progress and social status. At first, the strategy seemed flawless, but the automobile industry was changing rapidly, and the same corporate structure that had created DeSoto's success would eventually produce a problem Chrysler executives had not anticipated. Because as Chrysler expanded its lineup of brands over the coming decades, the company would unknowingly place DeSoto in the most dangerous position any product can occupy in a competitive market, right in the middle. Chapter 2: Chrysler's Multi-Brand Empire Strategy. When DeSoto entered the American automobile market in 1928, it was not designed to stand alone. The brand was created as part of a much larger corporate blueprint developed inside Chrysler Corporation, a plan intended to compete directly with the carefully organized product strategy already perfected by General Motors. By the late 1920s, the American automobile industry had evolved into a battle not only of engineering and manufacturing, but of brand architecture. Companies were beginning to realize that success depended on offering vehicles at multiple price levels, allowing customers to remain loyal to a single manufacturer as their income increased. General Motors had pioneered this idea through a structured ladder of brands that guided buyers from affordable models toward luxury vehicles over time. Chrysler intended to build its own version of that system. Instead of relying on a single flagship brand, the company constructed a portfolio of divisions designed to cover nearly every segment of the American automobile market. At the base of this structure stood Plymouth, introduced in 1928 to compete directly with the affordable vehicles produced by Ford Motor Company. Plymouth models emphasized reliability, simplicity, and low cost, qualities that appealed to working-class buyers entering the automobile market for the first time. Above Plymouth was Dodge. The company Chrysler had acquired the same year DeSoto was introduced. Dodge vehicles offered larger engines, sturdier construction, and slightly higher prices, attracting buyers who wanted more performance and durability than basic transportation. Between Dodge and the top tier of the company's lineup sat DeSoto. This division occupied a critical position in Chrysler's strategy. DeSoto vehicles were designed to feel more refined and prestigious than Dodge models, while remaining significantly less expensive than Chrysler's luxury offerings. The brand targeted middle-class professionals, buyers who wanted style, comfort, and status without the full cost of a premium automobile. At the top of the ladder stood the Chrysler name itself, representing the company's most advanced engineering and most prestigious vehicles. When viewed as a complete system, the structure appeared almost perfectly balanced. A young buyer might begin with a Plymouth as their first car. Years later, as their income improved, they could move to a Dodge. Eventually, they might purchase a DeSoto to reflect their rising social status, and later still upgrade to a Chrysler model offering greater luxury and prestige. For Chrysler executives, the advantage of this strategy was obvious. Customers would not need to leave the company as their financial circumstances changed. Instead, they could progress upward through Chrysler's own family of brands. During the 1930s and 1940s, this approach appeared highly effective. Despite the economic devastation of the Great Depression, Chrysler maintained a stable presence within the American automobile industry. The company's layered structure allowed it to adjust production depending on economic conditions. Lower-priced Plymouth models continued selling during difficult years, while higher-tier divisions recovered quickly when the economy improved. Following World War II, the strategy became even more valuable. The United States entered an extraordinary period of economic expansion. Millions of returning soldiers joined the workforce. Suburban housing development spread rapidly across the country, and automobile ownership became essential to everyday life. Demand for vehicles surged, and Chrysler's multi-brand structure allowed the company to compete across nearly every level of the market simultaneously. From a corporate perspective, the system looked remarkably efficient. Each division addressed a different group of customers. Each brand represented a different level of price and prestige, and together they formed a complete automotive ecosystem. But maintaining such a structure required something extremely delicate: clear separation between the brands. Each division needed its own identity, its own design language, and its own place in the marketplace. If two brands began offering vehicles that looked too similar or cost nearly the same, customers would inevitably begin questioning why both existed. For many years, those distinctions remained visible. Plymouth represented affordability. Dodge emphasized durability and performance. DeSoto conveyed a sense of refined middle-class status. Chrysler stood for luxury and engineering prestige. Yet as automotive technology improved and manufacturing methods became more efficient, maintaining those boundaries became increasingly difficult. Engineering components were shared across divisions. Production costs declined. Features that once appeared only on higher-priced cars gradually spread through multiple brands. At first, these changes seemed harmless, but slowly, the differences between Chrysler's divisions began to narrow. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Customers walking into a dealership could find vehicles from different Chrysler brands that were surprisingly similar in performance, styling, and price. For Plymouth and Dodge, the distinction remained relatively clear. For DeSoto, however, the situation was becoming more complicated. Placed directly between Dodge and Chrysler in the company's structure, the brand occupied a position that depended entirely on maintaining a visible gap between the divisions surrounding it. If Dodge grew more sophisticated, it could begin attracting DeSoto's buyers. If Chrysler models became more accessible, customers might skip DeSoto entirely and move directly to the company's flagship brand. At first, these possibilities remained theoretical. Sales were strong, the economy was expanding, and Chrysler executives saw no immediate reason to question the structure that had served them so well. But the strategy that had created DeSoto's success contained a hidden vulnerability. Because the closer Chrysler's brands moved toward one another, the harder it became to justify the existence of the division sitting between them. And as the automobile industry entered the highly competitive decade of the 1950s, that vulnerability would begin to reveal itself. Chapter 3: Expansion and National Success. During the 1930s and 1940s, DeSoto evolved from a promising new division into one of the most recognizable names in the American automobile industry. What had begun in 1928 as an ambitious experiment inside Chrysler Corporation gradually matured into a brand with national reach, a loyal customer base, and a reputation for dependable engineering. Part of that success came from Chrysler's rapidly expanding dealer network. Across the United States, new showrooms appeared in growing cities, industrial towns, and rural communities where automobile ownership was becoming increasingly common. These dealerships were not simply sales locations, they were symbols of a new kind of mobility that was transforming American society. By the late 1930s, the automobile had already reshaped daily life, influencing where people lived, how they traveled to work, and how cities expanded beyond their original boundaries. Within this changing landscape, DeSoto developed a clear identity. Its vehicles were designed to offer more comfort and refinement than entry-level cars, while remaining far less expensive than luxury models. For middle-class buyers, the brand represented a practical step upward, an automobile that felt modern and sophisticated without appearing extravagant. Engineering played an important role in shaping that reputation. Chrysler had long invested heavily in technical innovation, and DeSoto benefited directly from these developments. One of the most notable examples appeared in the late 1930s with the introduction of fluid drive, an early semi-automatic transmission system that made driving smoother and easier. The technology reduced the need for constant clutch engagement, allowing drivers to move through traffic with greater comfort and less effort. At a time when most vehicles still required significant manual control, this feature positioned DeSoto as a brand associated with mechanical refinement and forward-thinking design. But the progress of the automobile industry would soon be interrupted by a global conflict. When the United States entered World War II, civilian automobile production across the country came to an abrupt halt. American factories that had once produced passenger vehicles were rapidly converted to support wartime manufacturing. Automobile plants began building tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks, and other equipment essential to the Allied war effort. Like every major car manufacturer, Chrysler temporarily shifted its focus away from consumer vehicles. Assembly lines that once built DeSoto sedans were redirected toward military production, and automobile showrooms across the country stopped receiving new models for several years. Yet this interruption also set the stage for an extraordinary period of growth. When the war ended in 1945, the United States entered one of the most powerful economic expansions in its history. Industrial production surged as factories returned to civilian manufacturing. Millions of returning soldiers entered the workforce, bringing with them new ambitions for home ownership, family life, and personal mobility. Automobiles became central to this transformation. Across the country, new suburban communities began to spread outward from major cities. Families moved away from crowded urban centers into newly constructed neighborhoods connected by highways and commuter roads. For these households, owning a reliable automobile was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. Demand for cars exploded. Manufacturers struggled to keep up as consumers rushed to replace the aging vehicles they had been forced to keep during the war years. Production lines restarted with unprecedented intensity. Sedans and dealerships quickly filled with customers eager to purchase new models. DeSoto benefited enormously from this post-war boom. Its vehicles occupied exactly the right position in the market. They offered drivers a step above the most basic transportation without reaching the cost of luxury automobiles. For teachers, small business owners, engineers, and other members of the growing professional middle class, a DeSoto represented a combination of practicality and prestige. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the brand steadily strengthened its national presence. New models introduced updated styling, improved engines, and more comfortable interiors. Advertising campaigns emphasized modern design, technological advancement, and the promise of a prosperous American future. By the early 1950s, DeSoto had become a familiar name on highways across the country. Its distinctive front grilles and flowing body lines reflected the design trends that were beginning to define the era. For Chrysler executives, the brand appeared to be fulfilling exactly the role they had envisioned decades earlier: a stable and profitable middle-tier division that helped bridge the gap between Dodge and Chrysler vehicles. Yet success in the automobile industry rarely remained stable for long. So the early 1950s marked the beginning of a new kind of competition between American car companies, one driven not only by engineering, but also by dramatic design, aggressive marketing, and rapid shifts in consumer taste. Automobiles were becoming larger, more powerful, and far more visually striking than anything that had come before. Chrome trim spread across entire front ends. Sweeping tailfins began appearing on rear fenders. Interiors increasingly resembled the control panels of futuristic aircraft. This design revolution would transform the entire industry, and for a brief moment, it would push DeSoto to the very peak of its success. But hidden within that same transformation was the problem that would eventually destroy it. Chapter 4: The Golden Era of the 1950s. By the early 1950s, the American automobile industry had entered what historians often describe as its most spectacular and competitive era. The United States had emerged from the devastation of the Second World War with an economy stronger than any other industrial nation on Earth. Factories that had once produced tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks were now fully focused on consumer goods. Steel production surged, highways expanded across the country, and the automobile became the defining symbol of American prosperity. At the center of this transformation stood the powerful industrial city of Detroit, where the headquarters and factories of the largest car manufacturers operated on a scale the world had never seen before. Each year, millions of vehicles rolled off assembly lines owned by Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Chrysler Corporation. Together, these companies controlled the vast majority of the American automobile market and dominated global automotive production. Competition between them was fierce. During the early decades of the automobile industry, success had been driven primarily by engineering and manufacturing efficiency. But by the 1950s, something had changed. Automobiles were no longer judged solely by their mechanical reliability or fuel efficiency. Design has become just as important as performance. Car companies began competing in what many journalists of the time described as the styling wars. Every year, manufacturers introduced increasingly dramatic designs intended to capture the imagination of American consumers. Vehicles grew longer, wider, and more powerful. Massive chrome grilles dominated the front of the cars, reflecting sunlight like polished mirrors. Rear fins rose higher with each new model year, Inspired partly by the jet aircraft that symbolized technological progress during the early Cold War era, the automobile was no longer just transportation. It has become a cultural statement, and few brands embrace this transformation more enthusiastically than DeSoto. Inside Chrysler Corporation, executives understood that the 1950s required bold design if a car brand wanted to stand out in a crowded market. Chrysler invested heavily in styling departments and engineering teams capable of producing vehicles that looked modern, futuristic, and visually striking. For DeSoto, this period represented an opportunity to redefine its identity. Throughout the previous decades, the brand had been known primarily for reliability and solid engineering. But during the mid-1950s, DeSoto began emphasizing dramatic styling and technological sophistication in order to compete more aggressively with rival brands. The transformation became most visible with the introduction of the 1957 DeSoto model lineup. These vehicles represented some of the most ambitious designs Chrysler had produced. Long, sweeping body lines stretched from the front grille to the rear fenders. Tailfins rose prominently above the trunk, giving the cars a futuristic silhouette that reflected the era's fascination with aviation and space exploration. The front end featured large chrome grilles that projected both confidence and modernity. Inside the vehicle, drivers encountered dashboards that resembled the control panels of advanced aircraft. New instrumentation systems, improved suspension engineering, and increasingly powerful V8 engines reinforced the impression that DeSoto was part of the technological future rather than the mechanical past. For American consumers living in a time of economic optimism, these cars represented something larger than transportation. They represented progress, and the market responded. In 1957, DeSoto reached the highest sales figures in its history. Production climbed above 120,000 vehicles in a single year, a remarkable number for a brand positioned in the middle tier of Chrysler's corporate lineup. Assembly lines inside Chrysler factories operated at full capacity in order to meet demand. Across the country, dealership networks expanded to accommodate growing interest from buyers eager to participate in the new automotive culture of the 1950s. For a brief moment, DeSoto appeared stronger than ever. The brand seemed to occupy a stable and profitable position between Dodge and Chrysler models. Its vehicles offered more prestige than entry-level cars while remaining accessible to the expanding American middle class. The brand had successfully navigated the difficult economic years of the Great Depression and the disruptions of wartime production. Now, during the most prosperous decade in modern American history, DeSoto appeared perfectly positioned to continue growing. But the forces that created success in the automobile industry often moved faster than companies could anticipate. Beneath the excitement of the styling wars, deeper structural changes were beginning to reshape the competitive landscape. Engineering improvements were rapidly narrowing the differences between various brands within Chrysler's lineup. Dodge vehicles were becoming more sophisticated. Chrysler models were introducing features that once belonged only to premium cars. Slowly, almost invisibly, the boundaries separating these brands began to blur. Customers visiting Chrysler dealerships could now find vehicles with similar engines, similar styling cues, and sometimes surprisingly similar prices. For the executives overseeing Chrysler's growing empire, this overlap created an uncomfortable question. If Dodge was becoming more refined, and Chrysler models were becoming slightly more accessible, what exactly was the purpose of DeSoto? At the height of its success, the brand stood directly in the middle of Chrysler's corporate structure. And in business, the middle can be the most dangerous place to stand. Because the 1957 model year represented the peak of DeSoto's success, it also marked the moment just before the foundation beneath the brand began to crack. Chapter 5: The Identity Crisis. By the mid-1950s, the success of DeSoto began to hide a structural problem that had been quietly developing inside Chrysler Corporation for years. On paper, Chrysler's brand structure still looked carefully organized. At the entry level stood Plymouth, offering affordable vehicles designed for the largest segment of the market. Above Plymouth was Dodge, known for slightly larger engines and a more robust driving experience. Above Dodge sat DeSoto, positioned as the more refined choice for buyers who wanted something approaching luxury without the full cost of a premium car. And at the top of the lineup stood the Chrysler brand itself. For decades, this ladder of brands had allowed the company to guide customers upward through the market as their income increased. Someone might begin with a Plymouth early in their career, later purchase a Dodge as their financial situation improved, and eventually move into a DeSoto or Chrysler model. In theory, the structure offered Chrysler a powerful advantage. Instead of losing customers to competing manufacturers, the company could keep them inside its own ecosystem. But maintaining such a structure required clear distinctions between each brand. And by the mid-1950s, those distinctions were beginning to erode. Advances in engineering and manufacturing efficiency meant that multiple Chrysler divisions increasingly relied on shared components. Engines, transmissions, and chassis designs were often similar across different brands. While this approach improved production efficiency, it also narrowed the differences between vehicles that were supposed to occupy separate parts of the market. Gradually, the cars themselves began to overlap. Dodge models grew more sophisticated, introducing stronger engines and more elaborate styling. Interiors became more comfortable and visually striking, often resembling the features buyers expected from more expensive vehicles. At the same time, Chrysler's flagship models were becoming slightly more accessible. Improvements in production technology allowed the company to offer more luxurious features at prices that were not dramatically higher than those of DeSoto. As a result, the gap between the brands began to shrink. For consumers visiting a dealership, the difference between a Dodge, a DeSoto, and a Chrysler was no longer as obvious as it had once been. A customer comparing vehicles might discover that a well-equipped Dodge provided nearly the same driving experience as a DeSoto. Another buyer might realize that a modest increase in price could secure a Chrysler model carrying a more prestigious nameplate. In both cases, DeSoto faced a difficult problem. The brand no longer represented a clear step upward. Instead, it began to appear like an optional middle choice that could easily be bypassed. The effects of this confusion were first felt on showroom floors. Salesmen who once presented DeSoto as a natural upgrade found themselves answering uncomfortable questions from potential buyers. Customers asked why they should spend more money on a DeSoto when a Dodge offered similar performance. Others wondered whether purchasing a Chrysler might provide greater long-term value. Explaining the difference became increasingly difficult. From the perspective of Chrysler executives, the issue remained largely invisible during the early years of the decade. The American automobile market was expanding rapidly, and strong economic growth allowed multiple brands to survive even when their roles overlapped. As long as customers continued buying new cars at record levels, the internal competition did not appear immediately dangerous. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. Within Chrysler's own dealership network, 3 different brands were now competing for many of the same buyers. Instead of complementing one another, they were beginning to divide the same pool of customers. And DeSoto increasingly found itself caught in the middle of that competition. When a buyer entered a showroom, the decision often came down to 2 questions. Was the customer looking for value or prestige? For value, Dodge offered a convincing answer. For prestige, Chrysler carried the stronger name. Between those 2 options, DeSoto's purpose became harder to explain. The problem did not immediately destroy the brand. During the prosperous years of the mid-1950s, strong consumer demand allowed DeSoto to maintain respectable sales numbers. The company continued producing stylish new models and benefiting from the design revolution that was transforming American automobiles. But success during those years masked a deeper vulnerability. DeSoto was no longer protected by a clearly defined identity within Chrysler's lineup. And in highly competitive industries, a brand without a clear purpose can survive only as long as the market remains forgiving. If consumer demand ever weakened, If buyers suddenly became more selective about how they spent their money, the divisions with the strongest identities would survive. The others would struggle to justify their existence. By the late 1950s, that moment was approaching, because the booming economy that had supported the American automobile industry for nearly a decade was about to face its first serious test. And when the economic downturn arrived, it would force both consumers and corporations to make far more careful choices. For DeSoto, those choices would prove devastating. Chapter 6: The 1958 Economic Shock. In 1957, DeSoto appeared stronger than it had ever been. That year, the brand sold more than 120,000 vehicles, its highest production level in history. Dealerships across the United States displayed the company's newest models with confidence. And Chrysler executives believed the division had firmly secured its place within the corporate hierarchy. But the prosperity of 1957 would prove to be an illusion. Because in 1958, the American automobile industry encountered a sudden economic reality it had not faced since the end of World War II. The United States entered a sharp recession. Industrial output declined. Unemployment rose above 7%. And consumer confidence weakened across the country. For many American families, the uncertainty of the moment forced difficult financial decisions. Large purchases were postponed, savings became more important than spending, and the booming automobile market that had defined the early 1950s suddenly slowed. For car manufacturers, the change was immediate. Across Detroit, dealerships that had once struggled to keep enough inventory now faced the opposite problem. Rows of unsold cars filled dealership lots. Showrooms that had previously been crowded with customers became noticeably quieter. New automobiles had always represented one of the most expensive purchases a household could make. And in uncertain economic times, it was often the easiest purchase to delay. For the largest manufacturers, the recession created serious challenges, but not immediate disaster. Strong brands with clear identities still attracted loyal buyers. Customers determined to purchase a new car often chose names they trusted most, vehicles from companies like Ford Motor Company or General Motors. But the recession did something else as well. It forced buyers to make more careful decisions. And careful decisions exposed weaknesses that had previously been hidden by the prosperity of the decade. Few brands were more vulnerable to this shift than DeSoto. In the booming economy of the early 1950s, DeSoto's position in the middle of the market had worked perfectly. Its vehicles offered buyers something slightly more refined than entry-level cars while remaining significantly cheaper than luxury models. But the recession changed the behavior of consumers. Buyers looking for affordability began moving downward in the market. Instead of choosing a mid-priced car, many customers selected cheaper alternatives produced by divisions such as Plymouth or Dodge. At the same time, customers determined to spend money on a new vehicle often chose to move upward instead, purchasing a more prestigious brand that justified the higher price. Both decisions squeezed DeSoto from opposite directions. Customers seeking economy moved below it. Customers seeking prestige moved above it. And suddenly, the middle of the market became the most dangerous place to stand. The effect on DeSoto's sales was dramatic. Dealers began noticing that potential buyers were walking past DeSoto models on showroom floors. Some customers asked why they should pay more for a DeSoto when a Dodge offered similar features. Others wondered whether spending slightly more money for a Chrysler would deliver greater prestige and long-term value. In many cases, the answer was difficult for salesmen to explain. As months passed, unsold vehicles began accumulating on dealership lots. For business owners whose livelihoods depended on steady car sales, the trend was deeply troubling. Dealers were reluctant to invest in advertising or showroom space for a brand whose future seemed increasingly uncertain. Inside Chrysler Corporation, executives began reviewing the numbers with growing concern. The recession itself was painful but manageable. automobile markets had experienced downturns before. What troubled Chrysler's leadership more was what the recession revealed. DeSoto's problem was not simply declining demand, it was structural. The brand existed in a narrow space between Dodge and Chrysler, two divisions that were beginning to overlap with it in both features and price. In good economic times, that overlap had been easy to ignore. But once sales slowed, the weakness became obvious. When consumers became more selective about their purchases, the brand with the least clear identity was the most vulnerable. And within Chrysler's corporate structure, that brand was DeSoto. The recession did not destroy the company overnight, but it exposed a fundamental question that Chrysler executives could no longer avoid. If Dodge could satisfy buyers looking for value, and Chrysler could attract those seeking prestige, what role remained for DeSoto? By the end of the decade, the answer to that question was beginning to take shape inside Chrysler's executive offices, because the recession of 1958 had done more than damage DeSoto's sales. It had revealed something far more dangerous. For the first time since its creation in 1928, Chrysler was beginning to realize that it might not actually need the brand anymore. Chapter 7: The Final Shutdown. By the end of the 1950s, the future of DeSoto was no longer being debated inside the executive offices of Chrysler Corporation. The numbers had already told the story. Sales that once exceeded 120,000 cars in 1957 had continued to fall as the recession exposed the brand's vulnerable position within Chrysler's lineup. Dealerships reported slower showroom traffic. Unsold vehicles accumulated on lots. Buyers increasingly chose either the cheaper Dodge models or moved upward to the more prestigious Chrysler name. Caught between those two forces, DeSoto's role inside the company had begun to disappear. But unlike many industrial collapses, the end of the brand did not unfold through a dramatic financial crisis. There were no emergency press conferences, no bankruptcy filings, and no public corporate scandal. Instead, the decision arrived quietly. Inside Chrysler's corporate headquarters, executives concluded that the simplest solution to the company's overlapping brand structure was to eliminate the division that no longer had a clear purpose. That division was DeSoto. The decision did not immediately shut down production. Instead, the brand would fade out through its final model cycle. The 1961 model year would become the last chapter in DeSoto's history. Even before production ended, signs of the brand's approaching disappearance were visible across Chrysler's dealership network. Many showrooms began quietly reducing the prominence of DeSoto vehicles on their floors. Advertising campaigns became smaller. Some dealerships removed DeSoto signs entirely, focusing their attention on Dodge and Chrysler models that promised stronger long-term sales. Customers visiting showrooms in the early months of 1961 could still purchase a DeSoto, but the brand no longer carried the confidence it once had. Salesmen struggled to explain why buyers should choose a DeSoto when similar features were available on other Chrysler vehicles. For many customers, the brand began to feel like a temporary option rather than a permanent one. On factory floors across Detroit, the end of the division arrived more gradually. Workers continued assembling cars as they always had, installing engines, attaching chrome trim, aligning body panels along the moving assembly lines. For many employees, the production process looked no different from previous years, but everyone understood what was coming. The cars leaving the factory were no longer part of a growing brand. They were the last examples of it. Unlike the dramatic endings of companies destroyed by bankruptcy or technological disruption, DeSoto's disappearance unfolded with remarkable silence. Chrysler did not stage a public farewell or release large advertising campaigns celebrating the brand's history. There were no ceremonies marking the end of production. The name simply began to vanish. Dealership signs were removed. Advertising stopped appearing in newspapers. New model announcements quietly ended. By the time the final DeSoto rolled off the assembly line in 1961, the brand had already begun fading from public attention. For more than 30 years, DeSoto had existed as an important step within Chrysler's carefully designed ladder of automobile brands. It had carried families across expanding American suburbs, appeared in showrooms across the country, and played a visible role in one of the most powerful industrial systems ever created. And then, almost without ceremony, it was gone. No bankruptcy headlines, dramatic collapse, or public funeral for the brand. Instead, DeSoto was removed from Chrysler's corporate structure with the same efficiency that had once created it. In the vast industrial landscape of Detroit, factories continued producing thousands of cars each day. Assembly lines kept moving. Workers kept building vehicles. But one name had quietly disappeared from the front of those machines. The brand had not collapsed in public. It had been carefully, deliberately unmade. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Legacy. When the final cars carrying the badge of DeSoto left Chrysler's production lines in 1961, the disappearance of the brand did not create the dramatic industrial collapse that often accompanies the end of a company. There were no abandoned factories or massive layoffs that shut down entire towns. Inside the vast manufacturing system of Chrysler Corporation, the machinery of production continued almost uninterrupted. Assembly lines that had once produced DeSoto vehicles were quietly reassigned to other divisions. Factories in the industrial landscape of Detroit simply shifted their output. Workers who had spent years assembling DeSoto sedans returned to the same plants the following week, building cars for different badges, most often Dodge or the flagship Chrysler models. From a manufacturing perspective, the transition was efficient. From a historical perspective, however, something significant had vanished. For more than 3 decades, DeSoto had represented a distinct idea within Chrysler's corporate strategy. It was meant to occupy the carefully measured space between affordability and prestige, a brand designed to capture the rising American middle class during the great expansion of the automobile age. When the division disappeared, that identity vanished with it. Within a few years, the DeSoto name faded from dealership signage, advertising campaigns, and new vehicle registrations. Younger drivers entering the automobile market during the 1960s encountered brands like Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, and Chrysler, but rarely the name DeSoto. The brand that had once sold more than 120,000 cars in a single year gradually slipped out of everyday memory. Yet the legacy of DeSoto survived in 2 very different ways. The first legacy is visual. Automobiles produced during the brand's most successful years, particularly the dramatic models of the 1950s, captured the aesthetic spirit of an extraordinary period in American design. These vehicles, with their sweeping chrome grilles, exaggerated tailfins, and futuristic dashboards, reflected a culture fascinated by speed, aviation, and the promise of technological progress. They were machines built during an era when the United States believed the future would be larger, faster, and more ambitious than anything that had come before. Today, when restored DeSoto cars appear at classic automobile exhibitions, they often attract attention not simply because of their rarity, but because of their design. They embody the optimism of mid-century America, an industrial moment when car companies competed to produce the most visually dramatic vehicles ever placed on public roads. But DeSoto's second legacy is less visible. It exists not in chrome or steel, but in corporate history. The disappearance of the brand revealed something important about how large industrial companies evolve. Unlike companies that collapse through bankruptcy or technological failure, DeSoto vanished through a quieter process: internal corporate restructuring. The brand was not destroyed by outside competitors, such as Ford Motor Company or General Motors. Instead, it was removed by the same corporation that had once created it. In this way, DeSoto became an early example of a phenomenon that would appear repeatedly throughout modern corporate history. Companies simplifying their product portfolios by eliminating brands that no longer fit within evolving strategies. To the executives who made the decision, the move was logical. To history, it became symbolic. Because the disappearance of DeSoto demonstrated that even successful industrial names are not permanent fixtures of the marketplace. In large corporate systems, products and brands exist only as long as they serve a strategic purpose. Once that purpose disappears, even a familiar name can vanish with surprising speed. Today, the surviving DeSoto automobiles, scattered across private collections and museum exhibitions, represent more than classic cars. They are artifacts of a moment when one of America's most powerful industrial companies quietly removed a piece of its own empire. A reminder that in the world of modern corporations, decline does not always arrive with dramatic headlines or factory closures. Sometimes it happens silently, one brand name disappearing from the assembly line, and then slowly fading from the road. Final reflection: the meaning of DeSoto. The story of DeSoto is not simply the history of a car company that disappeared. It is a reflection of how industrial empires grow, evolve, and sometimes quietly erase parts of themselves in the process. During the first half of the 20th century, the American automobile industry became one of the most powerful manufacturing systems ever created. Cities such as Detroit turned into vast industrial landscapes filled with factories, rail yards, steel mills, and assembly lines capable of producing millions of vehicles every year. Companies like Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Chrysler Corporation did more than manufacture cars. They shaped the geography of cities, influenced patterns of suburban development, and helped define the culture of modern American life. Within this enormous industrial system, DeSoto once played a very specific role. It represented a strategic idea, the belief that a corporation could capture every level of the automobile market through a carefully designed hierarchy of brands. For a time, that strategy worked exactly as intended. DeSoto became a recognizable presence on American roads, offering drivers a balance between practicality and prestige. But the same strategy that created the brand also made it vulnerable. As technology improved and the boundaries between Chrysler's divisions began to blur, DeSoto's position in the middle of the company's lineup became increasingly difficult to defend. When economic pressure arrived and competition intensified, the brand's uncertain identity left it exposed. In the end, DeSoto did not disappear because it failed to build good cars. It vanished because the corporate structure surrounding it had changed. In many ways, this makes the story even more revealing. Industrial history is often told through dramatic collapses, bankruptcies, strikes, or technological disruptions that force companies out of existence. But the disappearance of DeSoto shows another kind of ending, one that happens quietly inside executive offices rather than on factory floors. A brand that once sold more than 120,000 cars in a single year was simply removed from the corporate blueprint. Today, the remaining DeSoto automobiles preserved by collectors serve as reminders of a different era of American manufacturing, an era when Detroit dominated global car production and when a single badge on the front of a car could represent an entire chapter of industrial ambition. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the story. In the world of large corporations, success does not always guarantee survival. Sometimes the greatest threat to a company's existence comes not from its competitors, but from the strategies of the empire that created it.